Queridas seguidoras y seguidores de Diálogo con las Diosas, hoy nos encontramos en la Universidad de Exeter, en Inglaterra, para entrevistar a la maravillosa Emily Hauser, autora de la trilogía de Golden Apple y de la reciente publicada Mítica, una obra de divulgación para toda la comunidad lectora adulta y joven adulta que ofrece una visión del mundo de Homero a través de sus personajes femeninos. Las preguntas que formularé a continuación responden a los objetivos de mi tesis doctoral, que quienes no la conozcáis es un proyecto de investigación que se titula Nuevas lecturas de las heroínas trágicas a partir de la novela escrita por mujeres en el siglo XXI. Y buscan recopilar la opinión de Emily Hauser como autora de reinterpretaciones mitológicas e investigadora del mundo clásico acerca del fenómeno literario en el que se han convertido las novelas que nos ofrecen una mirada feminista y femenina al mundo clásico. Emily, thank you very much for having me here and for allowing me to share this with the followers of Diálogo con las Diosas.
Of course, thank you so much for coming, and it's lovely to see you all. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you. So we begin. Okay. In an era where classical studies and humanities in general are increasingly undervalued, why do you think mythological retellings, particularly those told from women's perspectives, enjoy so much widespread success? What does this reveal about modern engagement with the ancient world?
Yeah, it's such an interesting question, sort of why is this happening now and how do we situate that against what is happening with classics, right? It might seem contradictory, but to me they're part of the same thing, because it's the issue that we've always had with classics have been issues around accessibility, about who gets access to classics, about what it means for who. So it traditionally was very much for just kind of white educated men. And that is kind of how the system got set up. And what's happening in what the novels are doing is that they are essentially just probing that system and saying, why did that happen? How did that come to be seen to be normal? What happens if we look at the ancient world from this different point of view? And we don't think about it as just like Greek and Latin as the preserve of the elite, but as this wild and wide kind of mythical world that anyone can tangle with. And I think it's that is really opening up and then allowing so many more voices to engage. Now, my hope is that that actually is going to have a kind of roll-on effect, and that actually classics itself is then also as a discipline going to expand and broaden, and that we won't have that kind of old-fashioned association of like the languages with sort of something that is dry and dusty and old, but actually they are a key into these ancient civilizations. My hope is that this is what that is also going to do.
I hope you're right. In the Golden Apple trilogy, Chryses and Briseis bear witness to the brutality inflicted on women during the Trojan War, while Atalanta seizes control of her fate, Admete embarks on a perilous adventure, and Queen Hippolyta forges her legacy. Blade in hand, heart ablaze. How much of an eye-opener do you think myth retellings can be for our society?
I think, as you kind of outlined, what these figures can do are a lot of different things. So there are ways that they can open our eyes to a whole series of different challenges. So the challenge with Briseis and Chryseis for me was, as you say, the violence, the horror, the trauma of war, and the way that that is focused on women, because women are the ones who survive. So it's not that men don't suffer in the Iliad. And it's important to say that there are incredibly tragic deaths that are highlighted by the poet as a source of grief and a source of hurt. But the women are the ones who are left behind to bear the cost of that sacrifice. And whether that is the women who are mourning the men who have fallen, or women who have been enslaved and captured in war and raped. So in that case, what you're doing is it's an act of drawing attention. It's an act of saying, notice these women as well. Our eyes are being drawn towards the tragic heroes of the Iliad, but look at the women as well. With women like Atalanta and the Amazons, it's slightly different, because those are women who occupy a very unusual space within Greek myth. in that they are already challenging gender boundaries. So while the women of the Iliad are doing what women are meant to do, which is be meant to do within the Homeric universe, I should add that qualification, which is to be subjugated to men and to be kind of put into their economy, Atalanta and the Amazons are resisting and questioning that. And it's very rare that we get women like that. So with them, what I was doing more was saying, what does Greek society, or indeed the societies of the Mediterranean, look like when we do engage with women who break the boundaries, right? So it's two different types of women. Women who are within the boundaries and say, look at these boundaries, look how shackled we are. And women who break the boundaries and who say, look what could be, right?
And wow, that could be great. Regarding the previous question, have you ever been criticized for trying to rewrite the past? And if so, what do you think about that critics?
It's interesting because that was one of the things that was really my biggest concern when I wrote the novels. I think perhaps particularly, I wrote them while I was doing my PhD. And so I think I was also developing my own academic persona, right? And I think that I was worried that maybe that might be seen to conflict with my academic credentials. I think what's really interesting is that by and large, I don't think it has been seen to conflict. If anything, I think what's been wonderful about this process is that the more that I have seen the creative reworking as a part and a parcel of what I do intellectually, the more I've also been able to kind of try and shape that in the field. So I think I would probably not frame it in terms of resistance, but frame it in terms of this just hadn't been done before, or at least I wasn't seeing it being done. Someone who was doing a kind of traditional academic career, but was also trying to do something that was kind of fiction-based and creative. And for me, part of the kind of barrier or the obstacle to that was myself, my own kind of prejudices about what a classicist looked like. And once I kind of got past that and said, no, these are actually two halves of the same thing. They are two sides of the same coin. What we're doing here is we are trying to find the lost and the silenced voices of women, and indeed of all of the people who have been lost to the archives of history. What different tools can we use to try and find them? Fiction is one of them, but intellectual inquiry, academic inquiry, philology, which are the tools I use as a classicist, those are also valid tools. And that's been really empowering for myself, and then also to try and kind of project that outwards.
Yeah, it's important that we think about that as a dialogue. I think.
Absolutely, absolutely.
In your latest publication, Mythica, you provide a new vision of Homer's world through the women written out of it, but also claim the women who have studied and continue to trailblaze the study of Homer. Do you perceive different approaches or priorities when women scholars study classical texts compared to their male counterparts?
Great question. So, I mean, we were just talking about kind of merging fiction and nonfiction, and those, I feel like Mythica was really the book where for me that came together and I allowed those two to coexist. And I think, as you say, that other layer that was really important to me was not just the content of how are we recovering women, but also the intellectual history. Who is recovering them, right? And that's the kind of third layer in this story. We've been focusing on kind of women as receivers, but that's not self-evident. And throughout history, women have tended, even if they have had access to classical education and to be scholars, they have tended to be written out of that story. I'm not sure I would say that necessarily women see anything different. And I think I want to say that to start with, because I don't believe in that kind of essentialist binary. I don't think that a woman is necessarily going to look at a text and see it any differently than a man. But I do think that there is an act of noticing that you do as someone who is part of a larger community of women, and you have an awareness of the women who have gone across the centuries, you know, our foremothers. And I feel like perhaps that sense of connection encourages you to look in a different way for their stories. So it's not that the invitations aren't there within the text. It's not that you couldn't look for them. But I do think that as women, that opening is there, and that invitation more often tends to be taken. And the example that I kind of often think of with this is Emily Wilson's translations of the Iliad and the Odyssey, because I really don't like to say that she has kind of translated this kind of as a woman, because I think first and foremost, she's translated it as a brilliant scholar of Greek, as a translator, as someone who is engaging with the text, who is doing a project of outreach. But then there is also the layer that she has also noticed things that the male translators just didn't. And particularly with the enslaved women, that is a really important angle to the text that you just don't see in male translations. So it's just packaging all of that together, then women can bring something else to the table.
Yeah, absolutely. My next question is related to that, but in fiction. But I think that your answer is quite clear. But if you want to add something, if fiction written by women is different by men?
Yeah, I would say the same thing, in that I think that the impulse, the impetus, particularly towards the Greek myth rewritings, is an awareness of exclusion, an awareness of silencing and marginalization, both in literature and in society. And therefore women, again, it's not kind of essential, but it is because of this inherited societal and cultural exclusion that women come to the texts with an awareness of who has been written out of it, whose side of the story didn't get told, a certain anger perhaps at having been silenced. And that all of that creates an engine and an energy. I wouldn't even say particularly for fiction, because again, I think for Mythica, for me, that was actually a driver to non-fiction, because it was sort of like, well, how can I use that same energy, that same frustration with the fact that we have lost all of these stories, and instead of targeting it at the myths, target it at the real women who might be nameless in the historical record, who it would be very easy not to notice. And how can we do the same thing for them?
Yeah, in fact, in the prologues of the Golden Apple trilogy, you state an inclination on marginalized women rather than well-known heroines. However, characters such as Penelope, Helen, or Clytemnestra dominate modern myth retellings. In your opinion, why the literary world mostly keeps returning to the well-known heroines? Is there something that might make them certain characters more appealing than others to writers and readers?
It's an excellent point. And I think that for me has been a motivating force. If you look at the trilogy, I specifically didn't choose women like Helen or Penelope or Medea. And for me, that was because I feel, first of all, that when you're doing them, you are doing something that is rooted in or beginning from or arguing against male traditions. Whereas when you are dealing with nameless women or women who are completely silenced or absent, there is, to me, and it's not that it's more important, it's just a different project. It's kind of like I was outlining at the beginning, like with the difference between Briseis and Chryseis and their kind of attitude to society, the way that they are oppressed versus women who are at the margins. This is, again, a different thing where what we're doing is we're just kind of piecing together pieces of the puzzle. The women like Helen, who are so much a product of men's imaginations and fantasies, the work that is to be done there is almost in unpicking that fantasy. Whereas with the nameless women, the less well-known, the less recognized, it's about drawing attention to their existence, about saying that they mattered too. And to me, it's looking beyond the kind of headline names, the queens, the celebrities of the ancient world, into the ones that we just tend to spend less time on, because to me that channels us into all of the other women who were not as extraordinary as Helen in terms of the kind of legends that they gave birth to, but to my mind their stories still need to be told.
Returning to the point of women writing versus men, how important do you think it is for women to narrate themselves the stories of their ancient counterparts?
I think it's very important. I think in general, the project of rewriting is important, right? So I think, again, this is about making space for everyone. And this isn't just about women, it's not just about men, it's about everyone having a say in a collective past. I think what is important when I'm particularly thinking about women is that when you look at the ancient world in particular, and that's kind of like the area that I specialize on in terms of thinking about women as writers, you look at the amount of space that women take up in ancient literature, and it is so small. So I have an academic book that I kind of wrote about this, and I explore some of the numbers, and I still find them kind of mind-blowing, where basically we have the names of over 3,200 male writers in Greek and less than 100 women. So the difference, the scale and difference there is just extraordinary. Now, to me, that is one really important thing about women now writing back. In addition to all of the things that I said about what women will bring in terms of that kind of awareness, that anger, that sense of frustration at being written out, that need to redress the balance, it's also about taking up space and about saying that we have a place in the canon. We have a place to talk about these texts, and that doesn't mean there aren't really important reworkings that are done. I think of Euripides' Trojan Women, which is a brilliant reworking of the women of Troy. But we need women doing it too.
Yeah, as you mentioned, past is collective.
Yeah, exactly.
We own it as well as...
Exactly.
Oops. Okay. And talking about traditional discourses, what is the importance of questioning these traditional discourses, whether in fiction or in academia?
I think the reason is quite a simple one, in that it is discourses, it is myths, it is norms that generate ideas around who gets to say what and who matters in this collective storytelling that we are all engaged in. It might look like it is just a sales phenomenon, or, you know, the bookshops trying to kind of collect some kind of genre together. But I think if you think about it seriously, and you think about particularly the held value that classics has had for centuries in the West and the Western tradition, then doing this kind of work, it's work. It's not just, it can be entertaining. And that's the brilliance of the beauty of fiction. It can be entertaining, but it is doing something else at the same time. It is these acts of rewriting, revisiting, creating space, generating voice and agency, drawing attention to acts of oppression. All of those different energies are bound up into this.
Yeah, and it also allows people that don't go to the universities or that are not highly educated to be a part of its own past.
And that's both wonderful. As writers and as readers. Yeah. I think that's important to say as well, because I think what this has done is it has opened these myths and these texts up to a much wider readership, but also it has said to writers, there is a place for you. Publishers will publish you. You don't have to kind of be a scholar of Greek. Now, I know that that sounds rather ironic coming from me, but in some sense for me, I'm sort of doing that in spite of being a scholar rather than because of it. Yeah. And I think it's an important distinction.
Yes, absolutely. That's wonderful. Okay, moving on. Nearly a decade has passed since the publication of For the Most Beautiful in 2016.
That's crazy.
Would you stand out any difference or similarity in how women reinterpret myths today and 10 years ago?
Absolutely. And the biggest one, I teach a class on women's rewritings of Greek myth. And for me, that is such a joy because I get to revisit these kind of retellings every year. I add in new ones. So I'm sort of tracing through my teaching how this is developing. I'm thinking through it. I get to read the scholarship. It's brilliant. And one of the things that I think, reflecting on where the trend has gone, that I think is the biggest is that, as you point out, For the Most Beautiful was published in 2016, a year before Me Too. And I think Me Too has radically changed. I think for the better. Yes. I really think that it has given it an energy and an agency to kind of go beyond what in 2016 felt like. I mean, at that point, we really only had Margaret Atwood's Penelopiad and we had A Song of Achilles. And those were the only two reworkings. There were sort of other maybe less major ones, but those were the two kind of major ones. And it felt like at that point, it was more of a kind of literary, especially if you look at the Penelopiad, right? It's a very literary postmodernist intervention into the Odyssey. Doesn't mean I don't love it because it's brilliant. Song of Achilles, I think, different. But I think what happened after Me Too was that women realized that, again, it's going back to this notion of the collective. They have a collective voice, a collective agency, and that there is a power in standing up together and saying that harm has been done. And it's not hard to see the myths as a repository of that harm. They are absolutely full of sexual assault and rape. And therefore, I think it just gave a democratization, but also a hugely strong sense of purpose to what otherwise might have ended up feeling like a literary project rather than a cultural one.
Did any modern mythological retelling inspire or determine your narrative choices when writing the Golden Apple trilogy?
Oh, well, the Penelope ad. Yeah. I already said it. But like, basically, Song of Achilles, unfortunately, came out just a bit too late for me because I was writing in the fall of 2011 was when I was writing, and into 2012. So at that point, my kind of ideas were already shaped, but they were absolutely shaped by the Penelope ad. And that's because I read it during my PhD, and I just loved what it was doing for the Odyssey. I was definitely coming to this, as I said, from a literary angle. So I was thinking, look, the Iliad and the Odyssey are both really important in the canon, in the tradition of Western literature, but they are also setting up norms about literature being for men, by men, for men, about men, and the women being silenced and invisible, particularly Briseis and Chryseis, who have such an important part to play, made me think, well, I need to do this for the Iliad. So I didn't follow, in early drafts, I followed Atwood's kind of tone, and but I felt quite quickly
that's interesting.
Yeah, I just felt quite quickly that I wanted to make sure I made it my own thing. For me, I quite quickly also decided I wanted it to sort of be more young adult in tone, because for me, part of the project that was really important was the outreach side of it. And so making sure that it was really accessible for a younger audience who might not have had access to the texts, might not know what kind of engagements I'm doing, but that it could provide a way in. So it was sort of Atwood, but then I sort of pivoted it around to make it my own.
Nice, that's so important. And how does it feel to be one of the first ones to open these doors to the phenomenon of mythological retellings?
It is incredible. I don't think anyone could have anticipated how much of a phenomenon it was going to become. I certainly didn't. I think one of the things that still moves and inspires me is how much of a community this is. And I think it would be very easy. And I think traditional models of publishing, traditional kind of competitive capitalist models very much try to pit authors against each other. And one of the things that I've really adored about being part of this is that actually this is a community of women authors who really support each other. And it's not a clash of myths, but it's a mythic collective where everyone is very aware that you could even write on the same myth, but you will take a different approach, you will take a different perspective, and there is a richness to that, you know? It's not zero sum. And that awareness, the support, particularly within the community of women writers, I find extraordinary and just feel very lucky to be part of.
Yeah, that's amazing. Okay, what did you find most challenging about transferring ancient Greek sources like epic poetry to modern fiction?
Epic poetry is very much doing its own thing. It's got its own constraints. It's got its own sort of formal constraints. It's got its own audience constraints of expectations, of plotting and narrative and character. Language, of course, is entirely different. You know, do you carry stock epithets in? You know, is the kind of question that you need to confront, among many others. I think for me, because accessibility and outreach and getting the sense of the core excitement of the narrative was, for me, the driving part. And maybe not even the narrative, it was of the characters who were created as narrative instruments in Homer, who I wanted to make living and breathing people. So perhaps let's say the people, the women, were at the heart of it, and everything else shaped around there. So I wanted it to feel believable. I wanted it to feel historical. I wanted it to feel epic. But if you didn't feel the characters and you didn't feel what they were going through, then for me, I'd kind of gone off and I needed to kind of bring myself back. And that became a guiding principle through the novel that then allowed me to weigh up. Look, are you just doing this because there is this scene in Homer and you want to get it in? Or are you doing it because this is actually a really important moment for this woman in her character development? And it became a great touchstone.
Your retellings embrace fantasy, while many others rely on realism to adapt myths for modern audiences. In your view, what does fantasy capture that realism might miss? And where does realism still succeed?
It's something I really noticed, and I already noticed it quite early on reading Song of Achilles, for instance, or even the Penelopiad, which don't really have the gods. Now, I think I would maybe slightly hesitate to say fantasy, although I understand it falls within that category for us. For the ancients, of course, it isn't fantasy.
Yes.
For the ancients, it's just a different realm of existence, perhaps a slightly larger, more inflated way of being. And for us, I think that matches up to the kind of technicolor world of fantasy, right? So you can use those registers as an author because we as readers know how to peg those. We find it quite difficult to peg the idea of going down to a river and believing that that is actually a god. And indeed that god then might rape you if you wash in the water. So to me, it was, and again, particularly because I was looking at this from a sort of young adult perspective and from an engagement with Homer, one of the things I love about what Homer does with the gods is that he uses them to generate a sense of perspective, to generate a sense of relief from the kind of unrelenting kind of just horror of war. And I wanted to create that sense of relief. Now, it's really interesting because if you look at someone like Pat Barker, who to me is kind of perhaps the hyper-realist among the authors that we're talking about, she does the kind of opposite of that, where she just does not relent from the horror. And that is important, and that is the message of the book, is that that's what you, or the books indeed, that's the takeaway. For me, I think the using that sort of fantasy element of the gods was a way of drawing back and demonstrating just how when you get into the kind of mortal battles and you get into the war and the death, the frivolity of the gods, the fact that they just don't care about humans, the fact that they live forever and therefore they just can't be bothered. To me, that was a really important message towards then putting into perspective the toils and the struggles of humans. But it's sort of just different ways, I guess, of approaching the same problem.
When you came to Oxford, you started mentioning the muses because of Mythica. And I got a question about why did men ask for women for the history of men? I don't know if I'm explaining.
You are.
It caught my attention a lot.
In other words, why wasn't the muse male? Right? I think that there is a simple explanation in that there is a tendency towards an abstraction of women, and that is something that you see both conceptually and linguistically. So if you look at the language of ancient Greek, abstract concepts like justice or right, those tend to be feminine grammatically, and they are also feminine in the divine pantheon. Now, I think the reason why women have this tendency to be abstracted by men is because it is a way of interpreting women's role as it was then in both a way that is passive and absent, but also powerful and creative. And this is something that they would have seen with women because, of course, women give birth. And this is one of the things that men wrestle with from the beginning of literature, the beginning of history, is the fact that women's capacity for birth gives them an inherent creativity. And I think that those concepts join together then to create a female figure who is safely distant and cannot herself create poetry, because that would be worrying, that would be threatening, but she does have a connection to creativity and it enables the man. And it's that role as passive creative enabler that I think women have held for a long, long time, and it's enshrined in the Muses.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Thank you. Okay, last question. No, not last question, sorry. Would you point out any reason why, since the 2000s, most myth retellings from the ancient Greece come from the UK and the States?
That's a really complex question. I think it has a lot to do with the way in which the Western tradition also sees itself as rooted in the old seats of Western power. So I don't think it's an accident that it is Anglo-American, the old kind of British Empire, then America, which has become the modern 20th century and 21st century superpower, that political power, cultural power, literary power are all going together in a way to kind of respond to the old world power of Greece, right? So I think that is and to me, that's a problem, right? To me, I think one of the things that is really being kind of noticed, I don't know to what extent publishers are trying to rectify this, but is, for example, that there are very few modern Greek retellings by women. And to me, I think we need to have more of a problematization of why it is an Anglo-American phenomenon, rather than just saying, oh, great, we're kind of breaking down boundaries, because like, what boundaries are we really breaking if we're just continuing the old axes of literary and cultural power? So I think for me, looking forwards, one of the things that I think would be really exciting would be to see more retellings in different languages, in different countries. I think it's something we're starting to see. I think it is incumbent, and now I kind of move to my scholarly side, but I think it is incumbent on us as scholars to read those retellings and to study them and to make sure that they are also included within the conversation. And hopefully that will create just this larger mixing pot where we can see this as a wider shared cultural phenomenon, rather than something that is, perhaps with the best intentions, still becoming ring-fenced and streamlined.
The last question. Lately, I've been wondering why, as far as I'm concerned, we haven't yet seen films or TV shows adaptations of these novels. I know The Return about Pasolini came out last year, and Nolan's Odyssey is coming next year, but I mean adaptations of novels like the ones you've written. Because they have a booming success in literature in the past few years. Do you think big movie studios are less willing to embrace stories focused on complex, empowered women, or is it just a matter of timing and trends?
I think it's a matter of time, because I know HBO is doing Circe. So I think that will change this conversation. So I completely agree with you. And I think it's worth also pointing out that both Pasolini and Nolan are men. So not only are they not doing Greek myth retellings, but they themselves are also male directors. I really hope it will be a matter of time, and that once Circe is done and really takes off, that there is an awareness that these would do really well on the screen. Because this is the thing also about these retellings, is they are incredibly dynamic, they are incredibly cinematic. And so I think that there is a huge opportunity and possibility there. It will be interesting to see whether, I've been talking a lot about the literary canon, because that's where I come from. And I wonder if there will be that same energy of redressing the balance in the medium of film and cinema, which of course doesn't have the written text of Homer at the beginning. So it could be that perhaps it's particularly that sense of being situated within literature that is giving women as writers that kind of energy. But I absolutely think that it is something that could and should do well in film as well.
Okay, I think with these words of hope,
Exactly.
we can finish. Thank you so much for your time, for your kindness, for having me here. I'm really thrilled. And may the muses smile upon you forever so we can enjoy your stories and your research for many, many years. Thank you very much. Emily.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.